Hey everyone, Tim Higgins here. So we're going to talk about an issue that I run into with this awesome client that I just finished. If you upgrade from like a 4.7 to a 6.6 to a 6.7, Broadcom made a change to release automation in 6.6. Now, they said that they fixed an issue, but this customer had a really good use case where it truly wasn't an issue. It actually broke their process. Now, if you think about your deployments, what we have is you have deployment plans by projects. So if I click on this, these are deployment plans. These are not deployments. And what I mean by that is if I click on one of these, now I see the deployments that are set by this plan. Now this customer created the plan on the fly, which is very common. They have custom code that calls a web service that creates this deployment plan. Now in the initialized phase of this deployment plan, it actually scheduled the deployment to go into a calendar to be deployed later. Okay. So that is no longer valid. Okay. You no longer can deploy a deployment plan to itself unless it's complete. Okay. So the problem is the initialize phase was never completed because the plugin or the action here that actually did that, it's actually create deployment from deployment plan. That's the action that didn't work. That was no longer supported because this wasn't finished. Now we couldn't put the calendar pieces over into the deployment phase because it hasn't kicked off yet. Okay. So let me explain to you the workaround that I did for this customer, just in case any of you all run into this issue. Now, not saying my plan is the best, but you know what? It works very well. So the first thing we did was we created two different deployments. Okay, so if I go, I'm sorry, I'm clicking too much. Let's go look at our deployments. If we go over here, what I was going to do is look at the templates. And I have two different templates. So I created what I'm calling the original template, even though it isn't the customer stuff, right? So this could be global for anybody to watch. And then we have this scheduled deployment template. Now, in the original template, what it's doing in the initialize phase, we're going to go look at this. I'm actually writing out to some files that, let me see if I can pull it up over here. These files are actually just saving the work. Okay, and we're going to see this in a few minutes. It's saving the work that needs to be done. In other words, it saves the ID that needs to be scheduled for a deployment later. Now, I don't think I finished the use case, but in the initialize phase, it really worked because in the initialize phase is where they got all their approvals, right? They were using third-party ServiceNow, but they were going through the approval phases. They were getting the archives together, making sure all the artifacts were there and all that good stuff. And then once all that was there, then they would attach it to the deployment plan and create a deployment from that was scheduled later. So the concept is, what if I have a deployment that I want to deploy Saturday? Right? So a lot of this you could do manual, but hence it takes away the concept of a release automation as we want it to be automated. So let's go back over and look at some of these. Now, if I go over here, and we're just going to look at the processes because it's easier. So I created these two dummy ones, and in the initialize phase, first thing it's going to do is going to delete a file. Just make sure we've got a clean slate to begin with. Okay. And if I click on this name, we'll notice it's getting its deployment plan ID as the file name, okay? And then it creates the file, again, with the deployment plan ID of the deployment that needs to be scheduled, okay? Because that's kind of your glue. You're going to see that quite often. And then we go and we add what I'll call a parameters file. So this is just writing all this out to a text file. Now, the key to writing this out to a text file is the name of the file is actually the ID of the deployment plan. Okay, so that's kind of a link, and you're going to see this, so bear with me. And then we add the ID to a file that we call deployment plans ID. Okay, and that's pretty much it. And that's the end of the initialize phase. Now, that isn't it for the customer because before that they had all the approvals and all the stuff, but this is the very last step. Okay, and then we have our dummy deploy. This really is just writing to a file. I think I stopped it because I don't really care about this. This is a relative, but this is actually done in your deployment part of your template. Okay, and the thing about this too is these are running on separate servers. For an example, this is one server for Initialize Phase and a different server for your deployment. Okay, and that could be a relative depending on which, is it a database server? Is it a IIS server? Is it a web application, a Tomcat? Right, so it should be that way. Now, the new part of the flow, once that gets ran, and in their scenario, they're running this from the fly, right? But we're going to manually do this. So they're creating these parameters and passing it through a REST call, and it creates it, okay? And you'll see how to do that later if you know how to do that, because that's how we actually run this one. So the new one in the initialize phase, it goes and it looks for the files, okay? It gets the files details, and that's how I get remove the extension, right? This is just regex, and that's how I get the file name. And then from there, I'm saving the file name to a parameter in our property files, or in our, we call them deployment properties, or deployment parameters. I'll show those shortly. But we're writing that to that property file. So I have a problem. I'm a developer. I want to call them properties, but I think in here they're also called parameters. So you're going to hear me use that term loosely, but it's the same thing, okay? Because here it says property, and I think on the other screen it says parameter. But you'll see where we save this at. So this is the original deployment plan ID. So this is the one that wants to be deployed. Okay. And then we go down and we get that ID. Now this is probably redundant, but just in the speed of us building this, it was just easy for me to do it. So then we get the ID. We save it back to this right here. We're going to set the file name. Okay. So I get the file name. And when I say set file name, it's really setting the file name parameter, right? So now my parameter output file name is the ID from here. And then we go down, we get more of those parameters. Okay, you're going to see this in a few minutes. So here, what this is doing is this is looking in the server, but it is actually looking, if you look at this, this is PowerShell, right? So what it's doing is saying get content where the path is our tools server, which in my case is just C drive, right? And then the original plan ID, which is the ID of the new one, .text. And again, you're going to see this, so just bear with me when we run the example. I just want you to kind of know what it's doing. Where object equals target environment. So in that file, I've got something that says target environment equals, in our case, it's always going to be prod, because it's this example. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to split on my equals. I'm going to skip the first value, and then I'm going to join after the equals, and that returns this value, okay? So even if you don't know PowerShell, this kind of makes sense if you just look at it. Now, once it's returned, it is saved into this parameter, okay? Keep that in mind. So all these right here are these gets, right? Because I'm a developer, so I use get and posts, right? Or get and sets, I'm sorry. All these gets really are just getting out these parameters, okay? And a good way to look at it is when it's done, if I look at this, these are all the parameters that it's catching, okay? Now, let's scroll down a little bit more. Once that's done, then it goes back and it sets these property values for our deployment template, okay? And don't worry, I'm going to show you in a few seconds, so I may have that name boshed, but we'll get to it in a minute. It's the same thing as doing this one, okay? So once I get all those parameters, a good way to know that is any time I use the word ROC, that's, Release Automation Command Center, but anytime I use that, it means I'm using those parameters over here that we're going to look at in a few seconds. So basically, I'm just writing those out, okay? Now, since I'm in the flow, this is my initialize phase. That's all it is, initialize. I'll go show you those parameters real quick, just so you can follow me. So if I click here, see template property. See, I'm still calling them parameters. So it writes the values from that file into here. Now, if I'm talking too fast or you're not really tracking in a way because I'm bouncing around too much, just bear with me because we're going to do an example in a few minutes and you'll see it in action, okay? So let's go back over here. Now that's our initialize. Let's go and look at our actual deployment because it's the one that does the work. And when I say initialize and deployment, if you go back over here to your templates and we look at our schedule and our initialize phase, that's the one that's executed there, right? Schedule deployment. And our deployment steps is execute scheduler. Okay, so let's go look at execute scheduler. Now, if we look at execute scheduler, the first thing it's going to do is get those parameters. Okay, so it's going to get them and it's going to write them out to these properties. Very important. This name has to 100% match. Okay, lowercase, spaces, or whatever. It's got to match. Now, once it's done, these are the three original actions that did not work on the first execution. Okay, these were the 3 that had to move. And detailed, it's this one, this create deployment from deployment plan, that is no longer acceptable in initialize phase. I think the truth is you can't create a deployment from a deployment plan if that deployment plan hasn't finished. Okay, and I know that's a bunch of words just kind of gathered together, but basically you have to let your deployment plan finish before you can build a deployment from it. Okay, at least that's what I found from my testing. So we now have it in a different deployment, which works because the original one, it's no longer there. It will finish this time. Now, first thing we're going to do is just clean up some dates. So we're passing in some dates. Okay, this is some JavaScript that goes there and cleans it up. The output is my date and time. The deployment plan, if I look here, is all those parameters that we're getting from above. Okay, and then the output is the ID. And the most important one of all this is if you go down and look, this is the one that does my scheduling. So with it, it's a post. I expect a 200. If I look at the body is the new deployment plan ID, which comes from here, the date and time, which comes from here. And this right here should be parameterized also, but just for now, it's hard-coded. So let's hit cancel. And that's pretty much it. So let's recap over here on looking in our templates before we do a test. Now we got our 2 templates. We got the original template, and the original template, the initialize flow, is what creates these files for us. Okay, and then this is going to wait because this is the one we're waiting to schedule. Then if we, let's go back there. And if I hit my schedule template, this is the new one. This is going to read in the parameters and write them over here. This one then is going to take these parameters and pass it to the, it creates the deployment from the deployment plan, but it really schedules that. So it doesn't create it automatically. It schedules it to be created. Okay, so with saying that, let's now see it in action. So we're going to start with, first, let's pretend that we're going to pass in a JSON script to do this. Okay, and you'll see how to do that in a few minutes anyway. So I'm going to create a deployment. We'll call it original deployment. And I think I already have a couple of those. We'll try 2. We'll try build. I like sticking build 1 because that's kind of relative, but let's see, or at least for this demo, it's kind of relative. Okay, so that's running. Let's give it a few seconds and see what happens over here in our working folder. Okay. It's an initialize, and I'm going to get an error because I haven't ran this today, but if we do, we'll debug it together. So there it goes. So now we're complete. Give me enough time to take a sip of my coffee. If I open this, I can see my deployment plan ID is a 76. I have a matching property file that's 76, and it has these values. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I hard-coded most of these, especially date and time, because I don't have an automated way to do this. But we're going to go ahead and set this one at, we'll say 10:30. Okay, it's about an hour from now. And then the rest of it, we'll just leave as is. Now, a lot of this, you'll look when we look at the script. I didn't hard-code these, okay? But I did hard-code the date and time, okay? So let's go ahead and hit next and save. Now in here, I have nothing, so we haven't got there yet. My deploy, we have nothing. And the archives, we have nothing, okay? So now if I go look, what did that truly give us? If I click on deployment plans, we have one from today, okay, 17th. And if I click on it and go to deployments, I have no deployment. Okay, that's what the next one is going to do. Now, I could manually kick off the next one, but what we're going to do is look at the script. To automate this, I created a script that calls a curl command action that does the work for us. So let's kind of walk through a little bit of this. So you know how it works, and then we're going to run it. So the first thing it's going to do is going to pick up this deployment plan ID file. This deployment plan ID, remember, it keeps track of what IDs that need to be ran, okay, or scheduled. Let's use that term. Now, if this is just some cleanup, right? So if the file doesn't exist, exit. If the file is empty, exit. Now, very importantly, we're setting some parameters. The first one creates the deployment plan, and the second one will run the deployment. Now, if you don't know how to do that, I recommend spending some time in the Swagger. I use it all the time. You want to do the public one, and it's a stupid name, right? Public IP, because technically they're all public. But the design, administration, execution, I don't really use those as much. I have used the execution some, but this is the main one I work in a lot. If you click here, you'll get the whole list of them. And the cool thing is if you just need to know things, like for an example, if I go down to here and I hit V4, right, because it's my version, try it out, then it gives me the body. Okay, it gives me these IDs that you're going to see. More importantly, it gives me my REST call that I can just stick in something like API strong, right? And I can test out my APIs there. Or I can come in to get this curl command, which is what we're going to do for our scripts. Okay, so if I come in here, sorry, I'm going to come back to here. So we set the path to those. Here we're setting some more parameters. Now, again, I hard-coded the name in my scenario here. I hard-coded the build, the description. So most of this is pretty much hard-coded from this point of view. Other than this ID, the ID gets created. Okay, so I don't hard-code that one. And I'll show you why in a few minutes, why these others are hard-coded. To me, they're kind of relative, but the name is very important, and I'll show you why. Now, the next thing it does is it reads in the file, and it loops through each line, okay? And I'm just calling them tokens, right? But my value return is tokens. And if you know anything about procedural program, we used to call, call to call in functions and methods and things like that. So here, I'm having a method named action. Now, function or method is pretty relative in this case. There's a very slim difference between the two, but that's a software engineering thing. But we're going to go in, we're going to call our action for each line. Here, it's going to copy. Notice it has the name, so it's going to copy the name from the working folder to my deploy folder, and then it's going to copy it to the archive. Now that's very important because when our release automation runs, it's picking up these parameter files from inside this deployment folder. Okay, and we'll look at that when we get to it. Then I set the name for the new one. Now, this one is going to be the value that is found inside this file. So at the end of my deployment, I'll have minus 76 as the name. The deployment name and the deployment plan, and the deployment will have a minus 76. That's part of your traceability. So when we talk about traceability, how do I map all this together? Is in my deployment plans, it tells me which deployment needs to be deployed. Then it picks up the matching file. Then it creates deployment still with that name, that ID at the end of it, okay? And you're going to see that. The other thing I did here is this is the curl command, and all this right here is just calling that curl action like what we said earlier, okay? Now, if you notice, a lot of this is parameterized from what's above, okay? So the first one is going to create a deployment plan, and the second one is going to deploy that plan. Then we're going to delete what's in that folder so it doesn't run the same one twice. Okay, so that's very important. Make sure the folder is empty if you're doing some debugging or manual run. Okay, because whatever's in here, CARA is going to pick up. Now, once that loop has happened, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to blank out the deployment plans ID. So we had a problem with permissions on Windows where some people had the permission to delete that file, some people did not. So in this case, we'll just blank it out, and then we'll try to delete it. And then we'll delete all the files because there's a couple logging files in there. So we'll go ahead and delete those. If you were doing some kind of debugging, you just comment this out, right? A comment is 2 colons and a space. You don't always need a space, but sometimes a colon itself, as you see here in my function, is a special character. So you got to be careful with that. So it's always important to have that space. And then we just, we give it like 30 seconds to time out. Okay, to give the curl enough time to finish. And then it exits. Now I'll put a couple of pauses in here so we can see it in action. So let's go ahead. Is there anything else we want to look at over here? Just really quick. If you looked in detailed, again, it's going to pick up the files. Okay. Notice it says files and deploy, and it's picking up any text file. That's when you want to make sure that's clean if you do it manually. Then that's when it gets the file details. So forth. We already walked through that. Okay. So let's go ahead and run this. Go ahead and close that. Let me get to, so you have the 2 folder structures, CARA, working, that's where all the files are, and then scripts. Okay, so we're just going to run this script and see what happens. Drag it over. So this is one file copied and one file copied. Again, I put some pauses in there. If you're debugging, just put the word pause. You'll see it in the script, and that will stop it until you hit enter a couple of times. But what I want to see is, yes, I have it in my archive folder. That's so you can come in here and debug later, right? So if I don't know which plan ID had, what time it got scheduled, then I can come in here and look, okay? And then deploy folder. This is the one that's going to be put in action. So let's go ahead and hit next. Okay, so now the curl command is going to kick off, and this takes just a few seconds. Now at this point, you could go to CARA and actually see it beginning to work. Okay, so we'll go in here, click on this. We'll go, deployment plans, and I have a schedule. Notice the minus 76, right? So that is part of our traceability. 76. I don't want to open these up because Windows is pretty picky about commands. But here in the 76, those two are together. Now, if I click on this and go to deployments, I can see I have one waiting to run. Okay, but don't do anything because it's running, right? We'll give it a few seconds. The curl command is done with its action. So if I hit enter a couple of times, it's going to wait. And then I could just hit enter to continue or wait for that few 30 seconds that we asked for. Now, this finished in the process. So if I click on it, so again, please don't get these wrong. I call these templates because they just make more sense. But these are actually deployment plans. And if I click on this deployment plan, I have a deployment that was here. This was created from our script. Let's go look at our folder just real quick. Notice our logs are gone. I do have the backup log for the curl command. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't remember if it overwrites itself. It's just a CC out, right? If you've ever done C++ or anything. So it's just a standard out. So I don't think it would overwrite itself, but it might. So if it does, and you just want to add something in there to save these if you don't want them, just rename them or something, right? If you don't want them to be lost. But it tells me that this was successfully created the deployment plan, and then it successfully ran a deployment from that deployment plan. Okay. So let's go ahead and minimize these. Oh, and let's go over here. We have our archive. Yep, we're good there. Remember, 76, 76. And how you get to that is if I actually do 76, then I'm there. So this is the original deployment, and I should have a deployment sitting there waiting, and I do. Okay, so that's how that works. Now, that deployment's waiting. Why? Because it was scheduled on the calendar, but not fired off yet. And there it is. Okay, so the green one is the first one that we did. If you highlight over it, you'll see that one finished. Okay, but this is the one that's waiting to kick off at 10:30. Okay, now these yesterday, if you're looking at this like, wait, tell me I got some blue. Yeah, I deleted them before I had a chance to kick off, so that the calendar kind of acts funny when you do that because I don't really care about that. You guys don't care if it actually ends the program because that's kind of bogus anyway. But the point is, wow, that's a lot of talking. So the point is, I hope I didn't move too fast. We had a deployment plan that could not schedule itself here in the initialize phase to get to this phase because the deployment plan, let me get to it so you can see it, because this action create a deployment from a deployment plan is no longer supported if the deployment plan is not completed. Okay. Now, I tried doing it through web services just to see if it truly was the action, but no, there's a reason I say it. I think it's the whole process, right? So your initialize phase has to be completed before you can schedule a deployment off of that plan. Okay. So that gets really confusing to some people. But again, if I go to deployment plans, I click on one of these. This is my plan. Okay. It has my artifacts, my steps, all that stuff in it. But this is the deployment from that. And now this is scheduled. The only couple of things I want to show you, if you want to debug this, I call it in pause mode or run mode. When this is like aired out or something, click on this run process. This shows you the events. But more importantly, if it's broke, like if it's red and you click on it, it would actually show you each step. And you can click on each step to see what happened. Okay, that's one good thing. The other thing we want to look at too, just really quick, is I would recommend taking that script and schedule it. So if you do a Windows scheduler, just type in schedule on Windows and it will come up. So let's drag this over. This is my Windows scheduler. Yours should look the same. We're going to go ahead. I would just create a folder, right? And call it maybe batch CARA. I mean, I don't care what you call it, right? Tomato. And then when I click on this, I can right click and say, you could do basic, but I like to do the create task, right? Create basic task, create task. If I click on this one and we'll say run CARA script, again, be more professional with your naming. Do not copy me. Maybe give it a description, because the point is if this runs for years and somebody comes in and says, what is this thing? And they delete it, then you're screwed. So here, run only when users logged in. That's not important. I mean, that's something you don't want to do. Run whether users logged in or not. I also run with the highest privileges. Hopefully that does your deleting file correctly. And I don't think this is important, but since I'm on a Windows 2000 machine, something like that, I always pick this one as well. Okay. I don't think it's important because a batch script is a batch script, right? Now, if you're running something that was Windows dependent, then yeah, but in this case, it's not. So we go over to triggers, we add a new trigger, and your trigger really is when does it want to run? So at this point, we want to do a schedule. We want it to run, like you could say daily, it occurs every so many days, but notice it's kind of locked into that. So you can change that as well. But what I do is recur on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. The reason I say that is because you can change it down here as well. You'll see that in a few minutes. And I want to synchronize across time zones. Now, I don't know what that does, to be honest with you. I think what it does is says, if I'm running this somewhere else, just link up our time zones, which makes sense. But I don't really care about that. So daily task for up to random delay. We don't want any delays. Repeat task every hour for the duration of a day. Okay. So we want it to repeat every 5 minutes, forever, basically. Okay. So you want to change that to indefinitely. And then stop task if it no longer runs, I don't expect this to get stuck because we do have, safe protection inside the, yeah, okay. I just want to make sure I was talking about the right one. I don't really care about this one. Normally I don't, because I put safeguards in the batch file that it's going to exit anyway. But that's if it's still running, just force it to close, okay? And it's enable. You'll see that in a few minutes. But let's go ahead and hit okay. And that's pretty much got it set. Now actions, we'll go ahead and say new. And it just wants to know, hey, well, what do you want to run? So we want to run the batch file. Okay, and that's pretty much it. And then you can pass in arguments, but of course we're not doing that in this case. And then conditions, I don't really do anything with this. Start the task only if the computer is idle. The only thing I don't care about is the power mode, because hopefully you're running this on a server and it should always be on, or at least you're not running on a local laptop. Okay, and again, I never touched this either, but you're welcome to read through it. Whatever works best for you all. Now, if I hit OK, it wants to know a name because I said with the highest privileges. Okay, let's see if I can. Yay, that worked. Okay, so and now again, I can set all this information here once you get it set. So if you need to change something, for an example, if your weekly thing is not working, then you can modify it. Okay, just right click, and I think it's properties. Yeah, it popped up on the other window. Okay, there we go. But you can also disable it from here. Remember that one checkbox that said enable? And then we can also enable it. And then notice these over here changed. I can also force it to run. I can end it if it's having a problem. So this is pretty common sense, right? You're adults. I don't need to explain all that stuff. But that's how you'd put it on a scheduler. And I'm going to actually disable this one. And I'm actually going to delete it, because if I don't, I will forget and my PC will be throwing all kind of errors. And I'm just going to go ahead and delete that folder too. Okay, there we go. So hopefully all this makes sense. If it doesn't, please reach out to me. The biggest concept is we had this original flow that couldn't complete because of a change in 6.6 in CARA 6.6. So we went to 6.7, right? So that's how we missed it. We went from 6.4, 6.5, 6.6, 6.7. But with saying that, we had to take the action of deploying itself out of the original flow, put it in another flow. And yes, manually I could come and kick this off, but again, it beats the point of being automated. So that's where the batch script comes in. The batch script is really the automation part of it. So Hope all this makes sense. Please take the time and, watch the video and just kind of read through it. And just pay attention to it. And if something, again, doesn't make sense, just reach out to me. And